Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we are covering how to quickly choose formations for your garrisons. Garrisons are important to Rise of Kingdoms, and the formation you choose can have a huge impact on that. So we are going to be covering the best formation for your garrison for the end game with the specialty inscriptions. First, for skill damage commanders, Wedge is the way to go. This includes Jan, Eleanor, Dido, Flavius, Lapu Lapu, and most commanders who go with these. The inscriptions further boost rage gain and skill damage, making their damage more potent. Second, for normal damage commanders, Arch is the way to go. This includes Gorgo, Zeno, Constantine, and most pairing partners for those commanders. Lastly, for shielding commanders, you can use either Hollow Square or Testudo. This is most notably used on Hera and Gorgo, when you use Gorgo situationally, and any other future shielding commanders. Note that Testudo only becomes better at more than 40% shield uptime, so choose based on how consistent your shielding is in defense. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we cover why health is so important. Health is by far the most impactful of the three main stats, and we'll go over the two major reasons that's the case. First is how health operates. Health increases the amount of damage the enemy needs to do to wound a unit, which reduces severely wounded units directly and indirectly counteracts a portion of that enemy's damage through attack, which is primarily what KvK tech gives, as well as attack being such a prevalent stat in essentially everything. Because of this, health reduces severely wounded units naturally, while also negating a portion of an enemy's stats, making it doubly valuable. Second, health is by far the least available of all three major stats. This makes it much less susceptible to diminishing marginal returns, the process by which successive increases in a stat result in less overall gain. This means even if you optimize for every last drop of health, you still won't come close to that diminishing marginal returns, and you can get extra value out of it. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we cover what makes Wedge formation so powerful in the meta overall. When it comes to formations, Wedge is king. Even with Scipio Aemilianus and William Wallace, a vast majority of commanders currently in the meta are primarily Wedge formation commanders. This comes from two fronts. First, Wedge gives skill damage boosts, which essentially boosts 90% of the commanders in the meta's primary source of damage. This means that Wedge is a natural choice even if you're not sure. And unless you have a shield or some sort of normal damage, Wedge is basically the single biggest increase in effectiveness as a base level. Second, the specialty inscriptions of Wedge do a great job of being super effective for most playstyles. Whether you need more damage, more rage gain, or anything in between, you get that from those specialty inscriptions. The widening niche keeps more commanders in the Wedge niche without incentivizing other formations as well, keeping Wedge firmly at the top of the charts for formations. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we cover armament recycling and how to decide what to keep and what to recycle. When it comes to armaments, you don't want to be caught flat-footed, which means you want to keep your options open and not recycle something you may need. But you also don't want too many armaments cluttering your inventory and gathering dust. And the more you can recycle, the sooner you can start racking up specialty inscriptions. So in today's video, we will go over how I decide what to keep and what to get rid of. First, try to keep one armament for each of the major troop types, except V formation, where you'll want to keep just siege items. You want to keep the best single one for each troop type, and to determine which one that is, you'll want to use the point system. For the point system, each armament stat geared towards that unit is a point. For example, a Wedge armament with 2 cavalry stats and 1 archer is worth 2 points for cavalry, but 1 for archer. Inscriptions that are combat specific are worth an additional point, and in the end, you're going to want to keep what has the most points. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we are covering why stat growth isn't necessarily linear. When you see a piece of equipment, armament, or skill bonus that gives health, defense, or attack, it has a defined value. 12% health, 3.5% attack, 7.5% defense. These stats boost your effectiveness in combat, but a common mistake is to consider them as linear. For example, early on, a 12% health bonus, when you don't have any other health, will improve your health by close to 12%. But once you start having technology, armaments, gear, runes, all boosting stats, that bonus successively diminishes. For example, in our original example, a single item boosting health by 12% and no other boost is about a 12% growth. However, in the same example, if you already have 50% bonus to health, that 12% boost is more like an 8% versus the prior stat value. This applies to each of the main stats. In the end, it doesn't necessarily upset the balance of any stat, but it's important to consider. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we cover the main 3 early game commanders you can consider building. In the early game, commanders are so much weaker than the Season of Conquest that oftentimes there's little reason to invest, and in fact, there's so poor uses of universal sculptures that they're mostly avoided. But for those itching to get commanders, there are a few commanders you can have that have field viability late in the game. First is YSG. His AoE is huge, skill damage equally so, and although he isn't as good as Liang, he's still a great option for your second march. Next is Alexander. While fragile, he has a massive 30% damage vulnerability debuff on his active skill, which is insanely great at any level, so long as you can protect him. While he isn't the top tier march, he's a great support pair. Last, but certainly not least, we have Saladin. Saladin is great as a third march pair option, as he has good tankiness and only has to be 5551, which saves you around 300 sculptures early on. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're covering the best free-to-play investments by troop type. First, for infantry, we have Scipio Prime. Even with the new commander releases, Scipio Prime just has that top-notch health debuff on his active skill, and smite damage commanders or not, he's not going to fall completely off the face of the earth, since debuffs are so universally strong. Next, for archers, we have Liang. Liang is YSG 2.0, and a pretty safe bet for free-to-play players. Huge AoE, good survivability, and synchronization with basically every other archer commander, including YSG, make for him to be a pretty safe bet. And last, but certainly not least, for cavalry we have Nevsky. Poe could go here too as a good single pair, but Nevsky just covers so much that even if you wanted to go branch out to a different role, Nevsky would probably be the right mix for it. He's synonymous with the cavalry meta, and the defense break on his primary is nothing to laugh at. And he's even going to be here for quite a while, even with Woe. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're covering the different field archetypes and their roles. When it comes to the field, you have a wide variety of pairs. Each pair has its own pros and cons, but they ultimately fall into 3 main archetypes, with some overlap. First, you have the damage dealers. This is plain and simple. These pairs are here to deal damage and put out as much hurt on the enemy as possible. This comes at the cost of being fragile, and focusing on these damage dealers is usually a scary prospect for them. Next, we have supports. These marches aren't the strongest, but they carry powerful bonuses and debuffs to help allies defeat enemies more easily. Whether it's a damage buff, health debuff, or anything in between, supports live to help their allies, and they pay a price for it in severe fragility. Last, but certainly not least, we have the tanks. These marches are incredibly sturdy and do not take damage easily. However, they don't have a ton of damage output, even having less damage than support marches, so they serve as a focus point for the enemy, acting as a speed bump of sorts, and trying to keep them focused on the... Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we cover early garrison options for events like Shadow Legion. When it comes to the early game, the garrisons are just not typically worth investing in, as the power creep is just so crazy. However, there are several events that could really use garrisons like Shadow Legion, so I'll quickly go over the most cost-effective options. First, Sun Tzu is the best epic garrison hands down. The damage reduction in AoE make him a nightmare for any event, and the AoE can tag many nearby enemies. Tack on that he has access to the skill tree and garrison tree, and he's just top notch for early defense. Second, YSG is a great option that does have field use. In the late game, you could pair him with Boudica Prime and Hermann Prime if you do build him, and his AoE is just super great, whether you're using him for Shadow Legion or another event that involves city defense. Last but certainly not least, if you don't want to build YSG, just go with the commander that benefits your main troop type in your city the most. So if you're cavalry, find a good cavalry commander. If you're archers, find a good archer commander. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we are covering the Civilization event. This is a recurring event that is themed based on different civilizations, but gives you the ability to get 5 tavern keys. So I wanted to quickly cover some tips to get it done faster. Of course, the Traveling Trader, you can't do much besides buy items. I recommend you buy items with resources if you can to save your gem supply, and use free refreshes every time. For the AP usage, just make sure you're sending out dispatches and travels if you can't be online to do forts or barbarians, but just use your AP. But for the gathering portion, you can do it in one trip. First, you'll send your first march to a level 6 stone node. Next, you will send your remaining 4 marches, 2 to level 5 or 6 wood nodes, and 2 to level 5 or 6 food nodes. This in one trip will yield the 1.5 million food and wood, as well as 1 million stone and 5 million total resources, allowing you to collect all of the gathering event things in one trip.